the winter of 1898, the ancient fishing port of Whitby clung to the Yorkshire coast like a memory refusing to fade. Stone cottages huddled against the harbor, their windows glowing amber against the perpetual North Sea mist that rolled in with the tide. Above them, the skeletal remains of Whitby Abbey stretched black fingers toward heaven, Gothic arches framing nothing but wind and shadow. The town had witnessed 1,000 years of storms, of ships lost to treacherous waters, of families waiting at windows that would never again frame familiar faces returning home. It was here, in this place where the living and the dead seemed to dance together in the salt-touched air, that a photograph was taken. A simple daguerreotype, captured in a parlor thick with the scent of winter roses and the hushed weight of mourning. The image appears, at first glance, to be nothing more than another testament to Victorian grief, another family's attempt to hold on to love when death had stolen it away. Two young brothers lie side by side on a narrow bed, dressed in their finest clothes. Their hair has been carefully combed, their faces composed in the peaceful stillness that the Victorian era demanded of its dead. The older boy, perhaps 10 years of age, sits upright beside his younger brother, his hand resting protectively on the smaller child's chest. It is a portrait of devotion, of a family's desperate desire to preserve what time had torn from them. But look closer at this image, past the formal arrangement and the careful staging. Notice how the younger boy's fingers seem to curl slightly, as if grasping at something unseen. Observe the faint tension around his eyes, the almost imperceptible suggestion that beneath those closed lids, something still stirred. See how his lips part just enough to suggest the ghost of breath in lungs that should have been forever still. For in the fog-shrouded town of Whitby, where the boundary between this world and the next had always been thin, a photograph meant to preserve memory would instead reveal a truth too terrible for any family to bear. The daguerreotype was intended to capture the eternal rest of one young soul, but instead it whispered the unthinkable possibility that one of the Whitby brothers may never have been dead at all. The Whitby family had called the harbor town home for 3 generations, who understood that in a town like Whitby, comfort was something earned through careful preparation and constant vigilance. The cottage smelled of salt cod and coal smoke, of the lavender soap Margaret made each spring, and the wet wool that never quite dried during the long Yorkshire winters. Thomas and Edward shared a narrow bed in the room that overlooked the harbor, where they would lie listening to the gulls and the creak of ship masts swaying in the wind. Thomas would tell his younger brother stories of the great whaling expeditions, of Captain Cook, who had learned seamanship in these very waters, of the jet miners who carved black treasures from the cliffs. Edward would listen with wide eyes, his quick mind already composing adventures they might share when the weather turned fair. The brothers were inseparable, in the way that only children facing an uncertain world can be. They walked to the parish school together each morning, sat side by side during Sunday service, shared the single piece of barley sugar their mother allowed them each week after church. When Thomas found a perfect shell on the beach, he would present it to Edward with the solemnity of a knight offering tribute. When Edward discovered a nest of baby sparrows beneath the eaves of their cottage, Thomas helped him fashion a shelter from scraps of sailcloth. But as 1898 drew toward its close, those who knew young Edward began to notice changes in the boy. His cheeks, once bright with the coastal wind, began to carry a pallor that no amount of sea air seemed able to cure. He would pause sometimes in his play, pressing a small hand to his chest, as if something fluttered there too wildly. Margaret would find him sitting by the window when he should have been sleeping, staring out at the abbey ruins with an expression far too thoughtful for such young features. The Reverend Morrison, during his Sunday sermons, had taken to speaking more frequently of life's fragility, of the need to hold dear ones close while time allowed. The congregation would nod solemnly, thinking of the fishermen lost to autumn storms, of the children claimed by winter fevers, of the way death could slip into households of Whitby, moving from cottage to cottage like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. The fever began with the children from the school near the Abbey, then spread to the families who lived closest to the docks, where the winter dampness clung most persistently. Dr. Harrington, the town's sole physician, found himself moving from house to house with his black leather bag, prescribing bed rest and laudanum, mustard plasters and prayers. The illness struck quickly and without mercy, particularly favoring the young and the frail. When Edward Whitby first complained of the headache that made him press his small palms against his temples, Margaret thought little of it. Children often complained of such things during the long winter months when they were kept too much indoors. But when the fever began to burn beneath his pale skin, when his breath became labored and his appetite disappeared entirely, she sent Thomas running through the frost-hardened streets to fetch Dr. Harrington. The doctor arrived at the Whitby cottage carrying the familiar scents of carbolic acid and pipe tobacco. He examined young Edward with the thoroughness that marked him as a man trained in Edinburgh, listening to the boy's chest with his wooden stethoscope, peering into his throat with practiced concern. The diagnosis, when it came, was delivered in the gentle tone reserved for news that no parent wished to hear. Scarlet fever had come to claim another child. For 3 days, Margaret never left her younger son's bedside. She bathed his fevered skin with cool water drawn from their deepest well, spooned drops of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and whispered prayers that seemed to echo in the small room like trapped birds. Samuel sat in the corner, his weathered hands turning his cap over and over, while Thomas pressed himself against the doorframe, afraid to come closer and afraid to leave. On the morning of the 4th day, as the first pale light of dawn touched the cottage windows, Edward's breathing grew shallow and irregular. Dr. Harrington, who had arrived before sunrise at Margaret's urgent request, placed his stethoscope against the child's chest one final time. The silence that followed seemed to expand until it filled not only the room, but Margaret's quiet weeping and the distant cry of gulls wheeling over water that seemed as gray and final as winter itself. It seemed that the younger Whitby boy had slipped quietly from life, but in death his story was only just beginning. In the Victorian era, death was not hidden away in sanitized institutions, but rather welcomed into the home as a natural passage that required proper ceremony and remembrance. The custom of post-mortem photography had taken root across England during the 1850s, born from the desire to preserve one final image of beloved family members when no other photographs might exist. For families of modest means like the Whitbys, this daguerreotype would often serve as the only portrait they would ever possess of their lost child. Margaret Whitby, despite her grief, understood the importance of this ritual. She sent word to Mr. Cornelius Ashworth, who maintained a small photography studio above the milliner's shop on Church Street. Ashworth was known throughout Whitby for his skill with the camera and his gentle manner with bereaved families. He had been documenting the town's moments of joy and sorrow for nearly 20 years, and his portfolio included wedding portraits, family groups, and the solemn memorial photographs that helped families maintain connections to those who had passed beyond the veil. When Ashworth arrived at the Whitby cottage that December afternoon, He brought with him the tools of his trade, the mahogany camera with its brass fittings, glass plates wrapped in black cloth, bottles of developing chemicals that filled the air with their sharp metallic scent. He worked quietly and efficiently, understanding that his presence in this house of mourning required both professional skill and profound sensitivity. The parlor was prepared according to custom. Heavy curtains had been drawn across the windows to control the light, while candles placed strategically around the room provided the gentle illumination necessary for the long exposure time required by the daguerreotype process. Young Edward had been dressed in his finest clothes, a navy blue suit that Margaret had sewn for him the previous Christmas, a white shirt with a carefully pressed collar, shoes polished to mirror brightness. Thomas, pale, professional eye trained to notice details others might miss. He paused, bending closer to examine the younger boy's features with the scrutiny of someone whose livelihood depended on capturing truth through his lens. The child's lips seemed to part ever so slightly, as if drawing breath. His eyelids, though closed, appeared to flutter with the faintest suggestion of movement beneath. Most disturbing of all, his fingers, which had been carefully arranged in peaceful repose, seemed to curve with a subtle tension that spoke not of death's stillness, but of life's persistent stirring. Ashworth said nothing to the grieving family. Perhaps he convinced himself that grief and candlelight could play tricks on even the most experienced eye. Perhaps he believed that what he observed was nothing more than the natural settling of a body recently deceased. But as he uncapped his camera lens and began the long exposure that would preserve this moment for eternity, a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold seemed to settle in the room around them. The plate captured more than grief. It captured something no one in the room dared to name. 23 years passed before the Whitby brothers' photograph would emerge from the shadows of private grief to capture the attention of the wider world. By 1921, the Great War had ended. The Victorian era felt like ancient history, and the science of medicine had advanced far beyond the rudimentary practices that had marked the previous century. It was during this period of social transformation that Dr. Eleanor Pemberton, a researcher at University College London, began her comprehensive study of Victorian mourning customs and memorial photography. Dr. Pemberton had dedicated her career to understanding how the Victorians processed grief and remembered their dead. Her work had taken her through countless archives, private collections, and forgotten trunks in manor house attics. She had catalogued hundreds of post-mortem photographs, each telling its own story of love, loss, and the human need to hold on to what time had stolen away. But none of her previous discoveries had prepared her for what she would find in the Ashworth collection. Cornelius Ashworth had died in 1914, leaving behind Dr. Pemberton examined the Whitby photograph more closely. Using the magnifying instruments available to modern scholarship, details began to emerge that troubled her trained eye. The positioning of Edward's hands struck her as unusual. In her extensive study of post-mortem photography, she had observed that the dead were typically posed with absolute stillness, their limbs arranged in perfect symmetry that suggested eternal rest. But Edward's fingers showed a slight curvature, a tension that seemed inconsistent with death's natural relaxation. More disturbing still was the faint suggestion of expression around his closed eyes, the almost imperceptible indication that consciousness might still have flickered behind those lids. Dr. Pemberton's investigation led her to the parish records of St. Mary's Church in Whitby, where Edward's death was officially recorded on December 15, 1898. But when she examined the broader context of that winter's mortality, she discovered troubling patterns. 17 children had died of fever in Whitby between November and February of that year, but medical records from the period revealed significant inconsistencies in how death had been determined and certified. Dr. Harrington's notes, preserved in his personal papers donated to the Royal College of Physicians, showed a man struggling with diagnoses that pushed the limits of 19th-century medical knowledge. His instruments were primitive by modern standards: a wooden stethoscope, a pocket watch for measuring pulse, techniques for determining death that relied more on observation than scientific measurement. The more Dr. Pemberton studied the evidence, the more convinced she became that something had gone terribly wrong in the Whitby cottage that December morning. The photograph that had once served as a family's final tribute to their lost child now appeared to be something far more sinister. Potential evidence of a medical error that had occurred in an era when such mistakes were both more common and more easily concealed. Had the Whitby family buried a son too soon? Or had the photograph captured a truth they refused to see? The phenomenon that Dr. Pemberton suspected in the Whitby case was neither rare nor unknown to Victorian medical practitioners, though it remained one of the era's most dreaded possibilities. It suggested that such incidents occurred far more frequently than official records indicated. The root of the problem lay in the primitive state of 19th-century diagnostic methods. Without reliable means of measuring brain activity, blood pressure, or even body temperature with precision, physicians were forced to rely on observational techniques that, while traditional, often proved inadequate for distinguishing between death and states that merely resembled death. Catalepsy, a condition that could cause complete muscular rigidity and unconsciousness for hours or days, was frequently mistaken for death. Severe hypothermia, certain poisonings, and extreme states of shock could all produce symptoms virtually indistinguishable from death to the untrained or poorly equipped observer. Children were particularly vulnerable to misdiagnosis due to their naturally slower heart rates and the way serious illness could suppress their vital signs to nearly imperceptible levels. A child in the grip of high fever might slip into a coma-like state, where breathing became so shallow and pulse so weak that even experienced physicians could mistake life for death. The case files from the period revealed dozens of instances where children declared dead had been discovered alive in morgues, or, most tragically, had revived during funeral preparations. The fear of premature burial became so pervasive during the Victorian era that an entire industry developed around safety coffins, equipped with bells, air tubes, and escape mechanisms that would allow the accidentally interred to signal for help. Patents were filed for dozens of such devices, though historical records suggest that few were ever successfully employed to save a life. The very existence of these inventions, however, speaks to the widespread anxiety that surrounded the determination of death. Dr. Pemberton's research into Edward Whitby's case revealed that the symptoms described in Dr. Harrington's notes, scarlet fever accompanied by high temperature and difficulty breathing, were precisely the conditions most likely to produce a death-like state that might fool even a careful physician. The rapidity with which the illness had progressed, combined with the limited diagnostic tools available in 1898, created perfect conditions for the kind of tragic error that haunted medical professionals. A living child mistaken for dead. It was not an isolated tragedy, but rather part of a far larger Victorian terror that claimed unknown numbers of victims who were buried before their time had truly come. The discovery of Dr. Pemberton's research findings in 1921 sent ripples through both medical and historical communities, but it also opened wounds that had never properly healed within the Whitby family itself. Thomas Whitby, now a man of 33, had built his life around a tragedy that had shaped every decision he made since childhood. The possibility that his brother might have been alive when laid to rest was a revelation that transformed grief into something far more complex and terrible. Thomas had never married, never moved far from the harbor cottage where he had been born. Neighbors in Whitby spoke of him as a solitary man who worked diligently at the shipyard, but rarely engaged in the social pleasures that marked other men his age. Those who knew him well observed that he possessed an almost supernatural awareness of others' breathing, that he could detect the slightest signs of distress in his fellow workers, that he seemed perpetually alert to the subtle indicators of life and death that most people took for granted. In the private letters discovered among Thomas's possessions after his death in 1947, a different portrait emerges of the surviving Whitby brother. He wrote of dreams that visited him nightly for decades, dreams in which Edward called to him from beneath the earth, dreams in which he heard scratching sounds coming from beneath the floorboards of their childhood home. He described waking repeatedly during those first months after the funeral, convinced that he could hear his brother's voice carried on the winter wind that rattled their cottage windows. Most haunting among Thomas's papers was a letter he had written but never sent to Dr. Pemberton after learning of her research. In it, he revealed that he had harbored doubts about his brother's death from the very moment Dr. Harrington pronounced the boy deceased. During the photography session, Thomas wrote, he had felt what he could only describe as warmth emanating from Edward's body, a subtle place. According to Elizabeth's account, Margaret became convinced during the weeks following the burial that she could hear sounds emanating from beneath the earth. She begged Samuel repeatedly to allow the grave to be opened, pleading with him to consider the possibility that they had made a terrible mistake. But Samuel, whether from religious conviction or simple inability to bear further tragedy, refused to entertain such thoughts. He forbade Margaret from speaking of her fears and insisted that their son was at peace with God. The weight of unexpressed doubt and suppressed horror took its toll on the remaining members of the Whitby family. Samuel began drinking heavily and died in a fishing accident just 3 years after Edward's burial, leaving Thomas and Margaret to carry their secret fears alone. The cottage that had once rung with the laughter of two brothers became a place of whispered conversations and carefully avoided subjects, where the living tiptoed around the possibility that they had failed the dead in the most fundamental way imaginable. For the Whitbys, the photograph that was meant to preserve loving memory had instead become a silent accusation that followed them through their remaining years. Every glance at the daguerreotype brought fresh questions about what they might have done differently, what signs they might have missed, what tragic error in judgment had transformed an act of devotion into a monument to unthinkable loss. For the Whitbys, grief was not the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a haunting that never left them, a burden of doubt that poisoned every moment of peace they might otherwise have found. The revelation of the Whitby brothers' case in the 1920s arrived at a pivotal moment in medical history, when the horrors of the Great War had driven rapid advancement in diagnostic techniques And when the scientific revolution was beginning to transform healthcare from an art based on observation into a discipline grounded in measurable evidence. Dr. Pemberton's research contributed to a broader movement within the medical community to establish more rigorous standards for death determination, helping to ensure that the tragic errors of the Victorian era would not be repeated in the modern age. The case influenced the development of more sophisticated medical. The photograph itself became a powerful teaching tool, used to illustrate not only the evolution of medical practice, but also the profound human cost of medical error. Students were taught to recognize the subtle signs that Dr. Pemberton had identified in the daguerreotype, learning to distinguish between the absolute stillness of death and the deeper sleep that might characterize severe illness or coma states. Historians and photographers found in the Whitby brothers' image a compelling intersection of art, science, and human tragedy. The photograph joined the ranks of historically significant images that had shaped public understanding of the past, becoming as important for what it revealed about Victorian medical practice as for its documentation of a family's private grief. Museums throughout Europe began displaying post-mortem photography not merely as curiosities from a bygone era, but as important evidence of the historical development of medicine and the changing relationship between the living and the dead. The broader cultural impact of the Whitby case extended far beyond medical and academic circles. The story captured public imagination during the 1920s and 30s, inspiring numerous works of fiction and contributing to ongoing discussions about the reliability of medical authority and the importance of patient advocacy. Families began demanding second opinions for death diagnoses, and public awareness of the possibility of medical error led to more thorough investigation of deaths, particularly among children and the elderly. Contemporary scholars have noted that the Whitby brothers' case represents a turning point in the historical relationship between families and medical professionals. The Victorian era's almost religious deference to physician authority began to give way to a more questioning approach that demanded transparency and thoroughness in medical practice. The photograph that had captured one family's private tragedy became a catalyst for broader social change that ultimately benefited countless others, who might otherwise have suffered similar fates. Modern forensic photographers and medical examiners still study the Whitby daguerreotype as an example of the importance of careful documentation and observation. The subtle details that Dr. Pemberton identified in her analysis continue brother's protective gesture toward another, the tender care that transcended even the possibility of tragic error. In the amber light of that Victorian parlor, frozen for eternity in silver and shadow, Thomas and Edward Whitby remained together, their story serving as both warning and comfort to all who gaze upon their faces. For in the end, the Whitby brothers remind us that the line between life and death has always been more fragile and uncertain than we dare to acknowledge, that love persists even when knowledge fails, and that the photographs we take to preserve our memories may sometimes reveal truths we never intended to capture. The Whitby brothers remain frozen in a single image, a portrait of love, loss, and the perilous line between life and death that continues to haunt and humble us more than a century after that December morning when young Edward may or may not have drawn his final breath in a cottage overlooking the restless sea.